Regulation has this meaning, but that is what's so fascinating about that is when you talk about regulation, these are the rules created by agencies like the Federal Reserve or the FDIC. They matter enormously, but that's not how risk is managed in our financial system. It's managed behind closed doors, in conversations between employees of the private banks and employees of these regulators who are doing something very different. They're not writing rules. They're making calls. They're making judgment calls. And they're managing risk through the processes of examination and enforcement.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. The connection between the banking sector and regulation has been an important one for many, many decades. And the new book takes a deeper dive into the historical connection between bank supervision and the institutions themselves. Pleasure to be joined here in studio by Peter Conti-Brown, who's an associate professor of financial regulation here at the Wharton School. He is co-author of the new book, Private Finance, Public Power, A History of Bank Supervision in America. Great to see you again, my friend. How are you?
Always a delight to be here and celebrating the birth of a new book. Couldn't be happier.
What is it that makes, with everything that's going on, what makes it important to look at bank supervision from a historical perspective, maybe even especially right now?
If you think about what we're experiencing in 2025 in the political economy of America, we're having really robust debates about how much private sector innovation should be occurring and how much public sector, meaning the government, responsibility should occur, and especially what forms both of these things should take. So when we're talking about trade, we're talking about private sector innovation subject to public sector control. So tariffs are about that control. When you're talking about questions of government efficiency, Doge, Elon Musk, all of that kind of thing. We're talking about how can government be more efficient on the one hand versus how are we destroying the capacity for risk management on the public sector on the other. And bank supervision is a kind of microcosm of these debates. What my co-author Sean Vanatta and I argue in this book is that these arguments are both very old.
Right.
We've been having debates since Alexander Hamilton about how you manage risk in the economy across that public sector divide. But they also take on new and interesting turns. And so our book takes the history through 1980, and we explore where this vast apparatus of risk management came from. When you think about, the way that you might manage the risk that a burrito you buy from a food truck might make you sick,
right,
the answer is you're going to manage that risk,
right? Exactly right.
And the food truck's going to manage that risk. And yeah, we have health regulations governing various aspects of a food truck, but by and large, buyer beware. Enjoy your burrito. Hope it goes well. But when you walk into a bank, everything changes.
Right. And you talk about the fact that truly having the right definition of supervision is an important component of this process.
Yeah, it sure is. I mean, the most popular understanding of banks' interaction with government is through the R word, regulation.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And very few people today. The term has become so fraught with meaning. Regulation is almost a bad word. I work in the Department of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at Wharton, but my chair is in financial regulation. My mother-in-law told me once, said, you should call yourself a professor of business ethics. That sounds so much nicer than a professor of regulation. And she's right about that in a sense, right? Regulation has this meaning, but that is what's so fascinating about that is when you talk about regulation, these are the rules created by agencies like the Federal Reserve or the FDIC. They matter enormously. But that's not how risk is managed in our financial system.
Right.
It's managed behind closed doors, in conversations between employees of the private banks and employees of these regulators who are doing something very different. They're not writing rules. They're making calls. They're making judgment calls.
Right.
And they're managing risk through the processes of examination and enforcement, what we call supervision. So what we're trying to do in this book is just say, hey, regulation matters. You should pay attention to that for sure, no question. But it doesn't matter nearly as much as where the rubber hits the road, and that rubber hits the road in bank supervision.
But going back probably well more than 100 years, maybe longer, there came a point where bank supervision became almost a necessary component, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, call the birth of federal bank supervision. Calling that date is a little bit difficult because it's not like a person who's born, becomes a teenager, an adult, and then dies.
Sure.
It gets born and reborn and changes again. But we've had bank examiners in the federal government's employ since the Civil War. The biggest inflection point in our book, and we argue in its history, is in the Great Depression.
Right.
As you'll recall, between the Hoover administration, the Roosevelt administration, 1932-33, the entire banking system shut down.
Yeah.
We called it euphemistically a holiday, but it wasn't anything to celebrate. It
Right.
was the question of whether we were going to turn into a fascist state like in Italy or Germany. And what we did instead was reinvent American capitalism through the process of bank supervision. What we said was these bank supervisors were going to come in and figure out which were the good banks, which were the bad ones, and thereafter individuals, consumers, businesses, families could trust in the banks, not because the bank said so,
Right.
but because a combination of the banks and the government said so.
Right.
And our book is a history of how did that come to be? What is the nature of that supervision, those negotiations between public and private power? And that's that understanding that tells us not only about history for its own sake, where the world's most robust economy and financial system came from, but how do we navigate these very same debates that we're having in 2025?
Well, that's the unique thing is the historical perspective of this. When you think about all the different things that have occurred over the course of century after century, that banking and supervision of it has had to react, and regulation has had to react to all of these different components and adjust probably to a degree as we went along, correct?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see just how much crisis and scandal has caused Congress and supervisors to kind of change the way that they approach things. One of the biggest changes that we saw was after the Great Depression and through this bank holiday and its recovery, bank supervisors got an enormous amount of authority that they were exercising. They were exercising that authority through discretion.
Yeah.
And the discretion was here. It's like, you look at a balance sheet that is on paper in black and white identical between two banks, right? But a supervisor will look at one and say, that's on its way to rot. And the other one will say, that's on its way to growth.
Right.
And what supervision became in the Great Depression was that discretion was really pretty empowered.
Right.
And so you had a lot more control on the public side, supervisors saying, this risk is right for you to take, this risk is not right for you to take. Now, a very big change came from Congress, actually, not the banks or the bank supervisors, by saying, well, supervisors are doing such a good job managing the financial system, so we haven't had a collapse of it since the 1930s. Let's give them more to do.
Right.
And so then they were in charge of enforcing anti-discrimination laws. Then they were in charge of enforcing consumer protection laws.
Right.
Then they were in charge of enforcing community reinvestment and anti-money laundering and different elements like that, all through the same apparatus.
Right.
And so we saw just this really dramatic expansion of that footprint, even still today, where there are big debates about what are the appropriate contours of bank supervision and bank supervisory discretion. Should they be allowed to say to a bank, hey, I'm not going to tell you in black and white rule of the road that you're breaking the law.
Right.
I'm just telling you, you got to stop doing this thing.
Yeah.
This is sometimes bank supervision by the raised eyebrow, right?
Yeah.
And banks right now, we're literally having a debate, was in the magazine American Banker today, like, should bank examiners have the discretion that they have?
Right.
And I wanted to say, as I read that, I was like, well, do I have a book for you?
So then, even though it's maybe not in the book itself, then the financial crisis in 2008, how does that play into the dynamics of the history of supervision and what obviously had to be changed at that point?
We stopped the book in 1980 in part because we wanted to convene a debate about it. And if you start telling stories about people who are still alive, they become pretty invested in those stories, and it's harder to have that debate. But we have a lot to say about 2008. Part of what leads up into 2008 is this cycle, which we call desupervision. You've heard of deregulation. Well, desupervision is where you try to make supervisors less responsible for their own discretionary decisions, right, and push more of that decision-making onto the private sector. And the long arc of the 1990s up to the 2008 financial crisis was a big desupervisory turn. And this came about through the creation of Basel II, this global framework that was basically saying to the regulators, don't supervise banks in the same way. Just make sure that they have systems in place that are supervising themselves.
Right.
2008, all of that blew up.
Yeah.
It basically came to stand for the proposition that banks can't self-supervise. And so 2008 into about 2017 was a resurgence of discretionary bank supervision. That's where we got things like the stress tests and the living wills and all kinds of things like that. And what's funny, Sean and I, my co-author and I, have been writing this book for a long time. We were graduate students together in the early 2010s at Princeton, getting our PhDs in history. And we decided that we wanted to start writing about this. And even in the life of this book, while we've been writing it, we've seen history take 2 more turns of the cycle about what is appropriate use of supervisory discretion. So this has something to say to risk management. Not only in 2025, but as the future continues to take those turns.
But then, even when you think of the Great Depression, and then you move through the course of the next several decades, obviously you have global conflict that kind of plays into a lot of the dynamics of the decision process. But obviously, there are also financial issues as well that plays out. So then, how do you think the process of what we saw supervision go through back then has kind of set the framework for where we are kind of right now?
Well, bank supervision is unquestionably an export of the United States. Central banking was not created in the United States. It was created in Sweden and in England, the UK. But the relationship of risk management, where the public sector owns the residual risk, it's on the hook when the system collapses. That is an invention, and all of the bank examination that led up to it, that was an invention of the American experience, mostly in the late 19th century, and then crystallized in the Great Depression. What that led to in the 1970s was a sense that we need to do this in a more globally harmonized way.
Right.
And so, the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, which came out of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, was the institutionalization of that conversation. And what we're seeing right now in the 2020s is kind of a disintegration of the collective global sense that this is something that we all as humans need to resolve together, as opposed to solving in individual national jurisdictions. And the logic behind the globalized harmonization of these rules is really strong. If you have different nations zigging and zagging about what constitutes a well-supervised bank, then you're going to have really hard problems, because money does not know national boundaries. It flows throughout the world. But the logic behind nationalizing these things is important too. It's the logic of nationhood, right? It's the logic of democratic accountability. And it's certainly the zeitgeist today. Left, right, and center, there is just a lot of skepticism about the idea that we can control global risks just exclusively through global bodies, as opposed to having national elections that really determine the contours of these issues. So it's the only thing I could say to that is just grab your bucket of popcorn. The future is an unknown country, and we have no idea how this movie is going to play out.
What do you then hope that you're bringing to light with this book that you and Sean have written?
Sean and I had a motto as we were writing the book, which is every paragraph a dissertation. And the idea was that we were learning so many new things that that had just never been engaged before in the literature, that in any paragraph that we were writing, a future PhD student could write a whole dissertation on that topic.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is do the classic thing that historians always do, which is to say the way things are is the way things were, and the way things are new. Right. So history has stayed the same, and history has changed. Right? We're always saying the same 2 things. What we want to say is that we want to tell the story of where this curious form of risk management across the public-private divide came from. And so we've got that story told well in this book, at least so we believe. But we also want to set the stage for a big debate about what we should then do with that history. One of the things that we're proudest of, the book's been endorsed by a bunch of people. We're so grateful for their enthusiasm for the project, but 2 people in particular who blurbed the back of it. One is Dan Tarullo, who was at the Federal Reserve from 2009 to 2017. And he was responsible from the Obama administration, really, for bank regulation after the crisis. And so he blurbed it. And then right after him is Randy Quarles, who was the chief bank supervisor under the first Trump administration. And they both read the book and loved it and just said, this is the history we need to have these fights. And those two agree on basically nothing else except that you should buy this book.
Well, then we need to go out and get it. Peter, great to see you again. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Conti-Brown, Associate Professor of Financial Regulation here at Wharton. The book coming out is Private Finance, Public Power, A History of Bank Supervision in America. Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.